What is up, everybody? Welcome back to Be the Number. I am your host, Spencer Aguiar, and I'm excited to be joined this week by Drew, better known on Twitter as Detroit Dave 7. Drew is the co-host of the highly acclaimed podcast, The Approach, powered by Fanshare Sports, and he's also a former PGA club and teaching pro that is one of the best sources on Twitter if you want some help with your swing. Once again, that handle is Detroit Dave 7, but I appreciate you coming on the program, man.
Yeah, thank you for having me. I'm very excited to be on here. Spencer, you do fantastic work, so it'll be good talking a little golf with you.
Well, I appreciate that. And I've been wanting to interact with you on a project for quite some time now. I do a show for Win Daily Sports with my co-host Nick called The Better Golf Pod. And the two of us were trying to brainstorm ideas for guests in his absence while he was covering football. Unsurprisingly to anyone that knows your work, you were one of the first few names to come out of his mouth as someone we wanted to have on that show. And while that is still something I hope we can do in the future, I bring it up because I think it shows the impact and headway you have made in this industry in a rather short time. I've made it clear to anyone who follows me in any capacity that Nick is one of the most brilliant minds when it comes to betting and DFS that we have in this space. And for the record, his Twitter handle is STIXPICKS, StickPicks, if anyone wants to give him a follow. But those kind of glowing endorsements mean something when they come from someone of his stature. You can correct me if I'm wrong here, but from what I know about you, I don't believe you've been in this industry for as long as most. Talk to me a little bit about what you got you started into creating content, and how did you team up with your co-host Rob to form The Approach?
Yeah, absolutely. And I certainly appreciate all the kind words. So it's funny. I mean, to your point, I've been in golf my whole life. I went to school for it. I took my playing ability test. I became a teaching pro, all that stuff. And so I did that for about 5 years. So my life's been attached to golf for as long as I can remember. And then, I was just getting into kind of social media in general, to be honest with you. And I was watching some golf shows and I was like, you know what? I was already playing DFS just because for somebody like me and somebody like you that's like watching golf religiously throughout the day, basically Thursday morning through Sunday evening, like you just become attached. And so I was playing DFS. I had some success. I was watching a show and I wanted a stream online, and I'm like, you know what, this is something I want to get into. So I did it with Hammercast and Dave over there for a while, and then Rob does a fantastic show, or he did at the time, his kind of DFS golf school show, and him and I connected, and we decided, I kind of bring a different perspective from the teaching pro side. And so it'll be a good kind of thing to get together on, and so we've enjoyed it, we've had fun with it, but that's kind of how I'm at where I'm at. It was just kind of out of nowhere, probably a year and a half ago, that I just decided to jump into this thing.
Yeah, not that the show needs it because you guys have a great built-in audience, but I definitely want to put my stamp of approval on it for all my listeners that may be hearing you for the first time today. I think what you guys do is very similar to what this program is attempting to accomplish, and that's to create an advantage over the industry by varying means. It isn't the cookie cutter approach of aimlessly mentioning golfers without a purpose. Everything you guys do is statistically backed. I always say my podcast is a data intensive show that is trying to provide insight more than an opinion. And I think you two do a great job of laying out the numbers and letting the audience formulate their own narrative from the facts. I've always believed that is something missing in the space because there is a certain pick-making nature where everyone is trying to one-up each other. But I enjoy listening or creating content where that perception isn't so cut and dry. It's why I provide a model for all my Twitter followers so they can make and create viewpoints of their own. But one of the questions I have asked every person as of late that has come onto the show is, what does a week of handicapping look like in regards to DFS or betting? I've mentioned on various occasions how I generate my own numbers and recalculate data to fit a time frame that works for me. But what does your process entail? Any data sources you use, strategy in general for building lineups, just anything that might give a different outlook for others to consider implementing while they're doing research of their own?
Yeah, absolutely. And now, since starting to do a show on Monday night, you kind of have to dive into it earlier than most would have to on a given week. A lot of people can wait for the data to come out, the ownership projections, things like that. So the first thing that when soon as Monday morning hits and the odds come out for specific golfers, you can kind of base it off the odds from a DFS perspective to kind of where people are going to end up being. And so that's kind of where I start building off of, right? And of course, you can fall back and you have your strokes gain data information from Fantasy National, which I use quite a bit. But the process is starting on Monday, and then it's kind of the dive into why I'm thinking a player, And then Tuesday, when Tuesday comes out and there's projections there, then I can start to base my DFS lineup and kind of my player pool from that point. Because once those projections come out, you can kind of eliminate for me, some of the golfers that we were thinking about. So if there's a guy, specifically that you thought was going to come in at like 5% and all of a sudden it's 18%, and they were right on the cusp with somebody else that you were liking, that's where the ownership projections come into play. And so it kind of like works its way from what we see on Sunday. You look at the golf course, what you think is going to be valuable for it. But then that's kind of where I go as far as my week's concerned. And by Wednesday, you're kind of set to go with your player pool, and you feel confident, or at least you make yourself feel confident, because that's what we have to do.
Yeah, I think you bring up a very good point. Your guys' show is on a Monday. For anybody listening to this, it releases on a Tuesday, but we're recording this on a Monday. So we don't have all the ownership that goes on throughout the week. As Drew just said, things become more comprehensive and you get a better idea of what routes you want to go. Sometimes deal breakers can be had and little tiebreakers get done from the ownership. We get a little bit of a general idea to start, but between Drew's show, this show, all the other great shows out there, ownership moves. I mean, people listen to it, and ownership's always going to be on the move that way. So, I mean, I guess that's one of the things I always try to say is just be open-minded, lock in the players that you like, but be willing to change if something comes into the space that you weren't expecting it to be. And, it's kind of funny because we're in an industry that any show you create has a shelf life to an episode. It's not like an ongoing series where you need to watch them in a chronological order. In this case, the golfers in the series change weekly. The sets change from venue to venue. And the only time an episode gets played is either right before the tournament starts or I guess after it ends. And after that, I mean, you can get some potential look ahead spots if people are using past recordings for research of a venue. But I don't think it would hurt anyone to binge some of these intros I've done over the past month plus. My plan has been to bring on some of the top minds in the space to not only handicap an event, but also talk strategy to help you become a more profitable DFS player over a long-term duration of time. I obviously try to maximize each contest with the information provided, but the screenplay restarts the next week from scratch just as quickly as it started. I've always wanted to create a more self-sufficient DFS player or gambler. And whether that's using my model or the strategies you've heard on this show weekly, I hope everyone can take something away from it and become more profitable moving forward with it. But in order to know how to break down this particular stop at the RSM Classic, we do need to look into what we have in front of us at Sea Island Golf Club. 7,005 yards, par 70 Bermuda greens. The property was designed in 1928 by Harry Colt and C.H. Allison, but did undergo some restorations from Tom Fazio in 1998. We have seen and covered a handful of Fazio tracks here recently, and the only thing I always note about what to expect out of his designs is extreme undulation. With that being said, Fazio did a good job of keeping the link-style nature that is about as pronounced as the day it was originally constructed nearly 100 years ago. I will run down some of what I noticed from a statistical perspective in a second, but I wanted to get your thoughts on the venue first. Did you see anything that stuck out to you, and what stats are you using this week?
Well, so it's interesting. So, with Thursday and Friday playing two different golf courses, it adds a kind of a different perspective to DFS, right? So we try to play guys that are playing the easier golf course, and then we also have to look at wind conditions. But this week, it's different. So on one golf course, I think on the Seaside golf course, of course, the wind's more of a factor. However, you also have to put the ball in the fairway. I think when we look at the Plantation course, it's more of an open ballpark. I know it has been renovated from recent, and it's actually played more difficult the year before. But to me, it's definitely when we're talking the Seaside course, hitting fairways and strokes gained approach. And we're looking at, if we want to break it down to the par fours, anything from 400 to 450. And we're on Bermuda green. So you always want to kind of bake that in. I do think surface matters to an extent. And what could come down to kind of a putting contest, that's certainly something to take a look at.
Yeah, as you mentioned, one of the biggest notable things to keep in mind is that players will be forced to play either their Thursday or Friday rounds on the Plantation course. Rotational events are always a little more challenging to handicap, but there are at least some similarities when it comes to green size and grass types of the two of them. I'm not going to go wild trying to model both courses into the mix. At the end of the day, yeah, I mean, the impact and the important rounds are going to come at Sea Island. But I don't mind adding in some emphasis on par 5 scoring since the one-off round will feature 4 par 5s on the day. I did not do that. That's not something I incorporated into my model, but I do think it's something that you could do if you are trying to make that into the mix there. Wind typically plays a factor with such narrow landing areas off the tee, and it does play as a benefit if you can find the short grass. On average, the field connects on 80% of their greens in regulation when hitting their approach shots from the fairway, which is right up there with the highest GIR percentage on tour. The putting surfaces are larger than average, and we have an eye-popping 9 par 4s that measure between 400 to 450 yards, like Drew just said. I'm going to call it 10 for the sake of my research, since one of them is just outside of 450 at 452. But the only two outliers are the 368-yard par 8th hole and the 470-yard 18th. The only other thing that I feel like is worth mentioning is that 8.7% more putts get made from 10 feet and beyond here than an average stop. That's a little troublesome when trying to build models because it's suggesting a putting contest. And the distance of 125 to 175 on approach shots is 8.5% higher than average. All the other ranges are below the median output total. So to quickly run through a model here, I started with a bullish 30% total on a weighted strokes gain category that featured courses under 7,200 yards, easy scoring, and Bermuda greens. It was a relatively even split between the three, but to me, those three stats encompass what I wanted to find at a venue that isn't perfect from a quantifiable sense. I also did 30% on a recalculated metric that took proximity from 125 to 175 yards and putting from 5 feet and beyond on Bermuda greens to try and figure out who would be most likely to give themselves opportunities. Some of the notable players in the top 10 of that category were Cameron Smith, Webb Simpson, Russell Henley, Brendan Todd, Cory Connors, Kevin Kisner, and Brendan Grace. As I mentioned, both of those are over 8% more impactful here than a random stop. I have 10% on moderate to severe wind. It's an easy course, but the one true defense will be wind. Par 4 from 400 to 450 yards for 15%. I usually don't like specific categories like this because we often don't have enough data to make it worthwhile. Plus, I don't believe players notice a 10 to 15 yard difference here and there. But the fact that I've rounded us off to 10 means over 55% of the scoring chances come in this precise zone. And then I finished with greens in regulation for 15%. To be honest, I was tempted to avoid all accuracy and GIR stats because I know those are going to be the two most weighted categories for the week. I think there's other ways to go about it than just doing that. But I decided to do GIR's gain because it was one of the top corollary stats I could find when searching past leaderboards. It goes without saying that accuracy is going to be needed to find success for all the reasons I've already mentioned. But I thought too many players were taken out of contention when using it for a course you can easily club down on and still locate the short grass. So that model yielded a top 5 of Webb Simpson, Cory Connors, Cameron Smith, Matt Wallace, and Russell Henley. When running it for upside, it featured all the same names, but swapped out Wallace for Chris Kirk. Is there anything you want to add to that, Drew?
Wow. That's, by the way, a fantastic breakdown. I love it. And I also think, to your point, especially from a DFS side of things, we have to we can't just plug in the numbers that every single person is going to plug in, because the statistics, as you know, all the stats are out there. You can kind of base it off of what everybody else does and kind of come up with the same thing. However, you put way more time into it. You know that just because everybody's thinking that these two things are the most valuable this week, where does that kind of like lead us, right? How are we different? Where do we gain value? And you do a wonderful job. And really just the stats that you can fire off is pretty damn impressive.
Well, I appreciate that, man. I mean, I put a lot of time and research into trying to make it different. And as you said, one of the most important things is to try to differentiate ourselves from the public here. We're playing in a contest with, users just like ourselves. And if everybody's using the same exact stats and the same exact models and the same exact timeframes to it, there's no edge to be had. And really, if you're trying to find an edge, then you're just going so contrarian against your own model to try to find them at that point. So I'm trying to always try to locate things that are a little bit different. I'm going to run models a little bit differently. Some of the stats end up being the same with it, but I try to use a different time frame from it to at least make it different. And that's one of the ways I like to try to separate my model. And I'm sure we're going to talk more about leverage and things like that as we get into this, because we do have some of these ranges that are kind of the popularity seems to be going to the same spots here. But let's talk about the $10,000 range. We're back to a more normal 5 players priced above $10,000 this week after having a few that featured 7. Scotty Scheffler leads the way at 10,900 and is followed by Webb Simpson at 10,700, Louis Oosthuizen 10,400, Cameron Smith 10,300, and Harris English 10,100. When you see this board, what stuck out to you?
Yeah, so at the top, the first thing that sticks out is how everyone's going to play Scotty Scheffler after last week's. The first thing that kind of comes to my head. So like he kind of faded at the end of last week, but do we ride that? So first of all, I would think Scotty Scheffler is a guy that I would be in on playing depending on ownership. But then I have to go to Webb Simpson as well. Course history speaks for itself, right? And when we have the same venue for an extended period of time that we can actually look at overall data, depending, it's been kind of, doesn't even matter how he's come in with form to this event. He's just always played really, really well. And I think there's some golf courses like that for specific guys. So Webb Simpson and Scotty Scheffler are the two guys I look to at the top, and we'll see where Scotty ends up as far as who's going to, how much ownership he has. But I do think it may take a dip from recency bias of the fourth round last week in Houston.
I think you're correct. As of right now, I am for Scotty Scheffler looking at about 14%. I would kind of be surprised if we see it end there. I think that's going to go closer to 10. We'll see what ends up happening with it. But, it's been a quick turnaround for Scotty Scheffler, who's just a few weeks removed from a much cheaper price tag. The thing is, though, that some of these spots can be intriguing when a player is marginally overpriced but comes in as one of the pivots of the range. As both of us said, I'm curious to see where Scheffler heads by Wednesday night. But it's the same theory I mentioned with him last week at the Houston Open. My model thinks he's a negative value against his price, a positive value against his ownership, and that's even at 14% right now. If it drops lower than that, then it's going to become a better play. And he is a betting favorite in all head-to-head matchups. Not that I take that to be worth a ton, but it at least doubles down the notion that multiple outlets have him as the man to beat. I'm going to keep an eye on where that ownership goes, but I don't believe that you must start in this $10,000 range. I do certainly think you have a couple options that stick out from the rest, and I will run down everybody like I normally do, but Scheffler would be one of my preferred plays if that ownership looks like it's going to be around 10%. My model always likes Webb Simpson, and he will jump off the page at a shorter course where he's found past success. We see that here with him ranking first for upside. Some of these spots can get weird with Webb, though, kind of for the reasons that you mentioned. He carries over his course history, probably the best of anyone on tour. I think a guy like Abraham Ancer is quickly falling into that mold also, where he plays these similar setups himself very well. But it's been a little bit more up and down for him at the RSM than we see at some tracks. 2 top 3s in his last 4 since 2016, 2 additional finishes in the 30s. None of that is overly concerning, but the recent form has been questionable with only 1 top 10 in his last 10 starts. Now, the thing with Webb is if we're looking at, shorter courses over the past year, a lot of what I just mentioned about him rolling over his success rings true. 7th at the Wyndham, 9th at the RBC Heritage, 4th at the Sony. If we go back to a year before that, 3rd at the Wyndham, 1st at the Heritage, 3rd at the Sony. I don't think he's as good here as those 3 places in particular, but there are trends for why he is popular, and I certainly can understand why anybody's going to play him. I mean, he is number 1 on my model for a reason. I think Louis has surprisingly gone ice cold with his putter, losing in 4 straight events and averaging -2 strokes per. He is leading this field in strokes gained tee to green over his past 24 rounds. So if he's able to flip the script with what should be the best part of his game, the stats are trending towards a big result. I do have some concerns with him for cash game type contests for the reasons I just mentioned. I think it's always scary when the thing you do best isn't working, but that can easily be flipped elsewhere, especially for something like an outright ticket. And I know Louis Oosthuizen and an outright ticket usually don't go in the same sentence together, but we don't need safety like that in a bet when we take an outright ticket. Like, we want the volatility, and I think Louis does give us a little bit of volatility there. I have no issues with Cameron Smith. I think he plays particularly well for cash. He's the number 1 ranked player in my model when looking for that recipe of irons plus putting, and is also 5th when it comes to scoring on easy courses. And then, like the rest of the market, I probably have the least interest in Harris English. He's off the table completely for me in cash after withdrawing from the CJ Cup when his back flared up a few weeks ago. I can see more of the interest in GPPs because of how he fits statistically in a few areas, but I prefer him on long iron tests than these pitch and putt events. He does have a 6th here last year, but 3 missed cuts and a 46 in his 4 showings before that. I realize that's a very vague answer I just gave in general. I mentioned a bunch of the top guys and kind of like them all, but ownership will be a huge decider for me. Like, it's something that we keep talking about. Some of these decisions cannot be made until Tuesday or Wednesday when we get some of the ownership to become a little bit more concrete with it. I do think there are routes to be more balanced this week, but it's a wait and see game for me right now. If you force me to make a decision, I guess I like Louis the best in GPPs just because, he looks to be the low man on the totem pole other than Harris English for ownership. A lot of that's going to stem from the reduction that you get there. I think the upside is very similar for him. Cam does lose one of his biggest strengths of only getting 2 par 5s on 3 of the days. Webb's form is worth noting as a deterrent when he's likely one of the 2 or 3 highest owned players on the board. And Scheffler's overpriced however you want to shake it, in my opinion. I can buy into him very quickly if this is going to be 10%, but I don't necessarily want a 15% plus owned version of him. That's my thoughts on it. It's just going to come down to ownership, but that's going to take us into the $9,000 range where we have 7 players. How do you see this range? And do you have anything else you would like to add to that first section?
No, I think we did a pretty good job covering it. To start out at 9K, I will go with Cory Connors. He's just a fantastic ball striker. We go to, 70% of his fairways right now. So let's think of it. If he's 70%, he's in the top 4th of the entire tournament as far as hitting fairways. And we know what a good ball striker he is. He's second in strokes gained off the tee in his last 24. I'm comfortable playing Cory Connors in the 9K range in this field. His game seems to be a complete game to me right now. It's tough when you think about Cory Connors because you think that the putter is potentially going to be the only thing that holds him back. But at the 9K range, depending on ownership, of course, but I actually feel like Cory Connors will be in my player pool this week.
Yeah, I want to bring up a stat with Cory Connors that I found interesting. Let me find it very quickly. So when I ran the weighted putting to try to incorporate this tournament over a random stop, Cory Connors was 29th in this field for me in weighted putting. When we look at his putting at any stop in particular, he is 63rd. So we see a nice little improvement from him there. And
I like that.
I'm going to actually, let's talk about this a little bit. So of realistic choices, because I don't want to start naming random outliers that move from like 120th to 60 and crack the top of my list. But here are the guys that saw the biggest improvement in my weighted putting that I ran. I took that core total and measured it against putting in general, as I just said. But the biggest climbers were Brandon Grace, Russell Henley, Cory Connors, Matt Wallace, and Charles Howell III. That gives us the 2 players that look like they're going to be the most popular, maybe of this whole tournament in Connors and Henley. So let me start with them and give a few thoughts. And I'm in agreement with you. I love everything about Cory Connors this week. I wish the ownership wasn't what it was. I guess that's the one thing I don't like about him. If they could have made him more expensive, that would have helped a little bit. But the Canadian checks all the boxes I was trying to find. Off the tee has surprisingly shown to be a little more impactful here than most stops. And that's a weird stat to measure on the surface because it has to do more with the importance of finding fairways. But we've seen guys like Luke List or Jason Day use that to their benefit in a unique route here. Connors is second in the stat over his past 24 rounds and grades inside the top 10 in strokes gained tee to green, strokes gained total, strokes gained at easy courses, venues under 7,200 yards, wind, Bermuda grass, par 4 scoring from 400 to 450 yards, accuracy, GIRs gained, and his combination of putting plus iron play. Like, it's literally across the board in almost all critical metrics that I was trying to find that he's a top 10 player this weekend. Because I like him so much, it makes me a little hesitant on what to do with Russell Henley. I view both of these in a similar light to what we got a week ago in Taylor Gooch and Aaron Wise. I do think each of these is a better choice in a vacuum, but I took the route last week that I thought Wise was better than Gooch and faded Gooch across the board in GPPs. Neither necessarily turned into a great value, but I do think one of Webb and Cam plus Henley or Connors, or even those 2 together, will likely be the most popular starts to a build. And the issue is we should almost be taking the week off if we can't get ourselves to diversify from that mindset. I believe all can be played in some fashion, but I'm not going to do it in the expected approach of everyone else. I'm going to find myself very overweight to Cory Connors as things stand right now, even at 20%, because I trust my model. but I'm going to go into builds with it that resemble more of a Louis start in him. Maybe I will add a random 9K golfer that I'm going to talk about shortly. Maybe I fit him and Scheffler into a build, but I think it has to be unique. Otherwise, there's no real difference to be found from the next user. If I do find myself starting with Cam Smith and Connors or Webb Simpson and Connors, I think you need to get a little bit more wonky in other spots. For single entry or 3-max, like obviously, I mean, I don't want to talk about cash games for this because I think it's such a different thing. But when you talk about things like cash games, single entry 3-maxes, ownership becomes less important in those situations with it. So it's something to keep in mind. If you're playing a single entry and you end up starting a build with Webb Simpson and Connors, I think that's better than if you do it in a really large tournament. But luckily, there are two $9,000 golfers that I do really like this week. In Joaquin Niemann at 9,700, that's not going to be a surprise if you've been listening to the show. I've been very high on Niemann for a lot of weeks now, and it hasn't necessarily worked out. And Adam Scott at 9,000. Last week was the first time Niemann has lost off the tee and approach in the same start since the Open in 2009. In fact, I only saw 3 occurrences to date where he has done that, and he's followed up every performance with a top 38 in the next outing. The putter continues to look bad, but I'm going to trust my math here when the whole industry looks to be deserting ship. Niemann will be the lowest owned player, $9,000 or above, it looks like. And I continue to like the leverage he creates. And Adam Scott is my preferred pivot off of Kevin Kisner. Kisner makes some sense as an outright ticket when we look at the 5 top 7s during his 9 starts at the venue, including a win. But 3 missed cuts have been sprinkled into the mix. He's averaging negative 7.98 strokes total over his last 6 starts, and that's including a victory at the Wyndham. It's been nothing but boom or bust for him lately. I don't love taking on that risk at over 10%. I think there's other ways to play him. Instead, Adam Scott has quietly been trending in the right direction. As many as you will remember, Kisner's win at the Wyndham should have been Scott's if he just drains his 3-foot putt in the playoff. And despite a negative showing with his irons last week, he has gained 3.28 strokes with them over his previous 6. The Aussie also grades top 10 in GIRs gained, DraftKings points per contest, long distance Bermuda putting, par 4 scoring between 400 to 450 yards, wind play, and my weighted category of short courses, easy courses, and Bermuda. I think between the two of us, we pretty much covered most of that range there. Any thoughts on Alex Noren? Any thoughts on Taylor Gooch?
The problem that's come with Taylor Gooch is, one, his off the tee numbers are good, which we're somewhat valuing that, more than we normally would on a week-to-week basis. But for Taylor Gooch, his ownership numbers have just kind of skyrocketed. I mean, look at last week, and his ownership was at the top of everybody. So yes, he's a solid player, but at some point you can't roll with that. So I don't know about if I would play Taylor Gooch. I'm with you with Joaquin Niemann. I do think another thing that comes into play anytime the wind's around is Joaquin Niemann's trajectory and ball flight. Fit golf courses fantastically. He can keep the ball extremely low with not a ton of spin. So I like that play as well. Alex Noren is somewhat similar, but if I can get a Joaquin Niemann at a low ownership percentage, then I'm absolutely 100% with you on that play.
Yeah, I agree with you on that. I think it just comes down to just trying to find the right spot. And I actually like Joaquin Niemann more than both of them also. And it's something that Andy Lack and I talked about last week on the Better Golf Show. When you have guys like Aaron Wise, Taylor Gooch, these guys that were in the $7,000 range for such a long period of time, and now all of a sudden they're $9,000 golfers plus, and they're getting, 10, 15, 20, 25% ownership. You've kind of missed the window on some of these guys, and there's ebbs and flows to golf. I realize that these guys are hot right now, but it's no different than a football game where a line moves a couple points past a certain threshold, and now you're on the wrong side of the line. So that's just the way I view it with it. I'm always trying to create a model where I'm locating these guys before they pop. And I think a guy like Niemann is trending in that direction. I know the results aren't necessarily doing that, but I've read these stats off a million times on this show. I think going into last week, it was 19 of 23 he had gained with his approach game, and 33 of 37 or something off the tee with it. And obviously you add a loss for him on both of those there. But I think Niemann, if he ever can just get hot with the putter, I think he has a chance. And as you said, he's one of the best low ball flight hitters in this field. And I think that's something worth mentioning here when wind comes into play. But I will start us off in the 8,000s. It's a range that I don't love as a whole. We have a ton of bad course history for whatever that is worth. Even if we take a guy like Mackenzie Hughes, who won it in 2016, he hasn't been better than 65th in 4 appearances since. Homa hasn't made a cut in 3. Vegas has missed 2 of 3. Rose is 0 for 1. Seamus has been disastrous with 3 missed cuts and a 74th, although I will get more into him in a second. But I will talk about some of the good that I did see. You would think it's a good course for Keegan Bradley at 8,900, where he can at least be competitive. He did come 15th here last season, but I do want to note that despite ranking 4th on Bermuda courses in this field, there is a negative putting trajectory that goes beyond just what we know about him. His 128th place ranking won't surprise anyone, but he drops even further to 144th when adding in the weighted putting that I ran. The reason for that is because it's more challenging to get it close on these greens. I noted earlier that there's an 8% increase from putting at this track from 10 feet and beyond. I do think he can be solid because of his GIR and accuracy. But you don't have to look any further than him losing 4.6 with his putter last year. I think there's a reason for that beyond the obvious of him being a poor putter. So, I mean, that's kind of my thought behind him. I think from an upside perspective, there's something that might be lacking there. Joel Dominant at 8,500 is certainly intriguing. I like where his irons are heading, having gained in 7 of 8. We know he can get hot with his putter in spurts, and there aren't many players that see as big of an increase as he does at a short, easy setup. Brendan Todd's erraticness scares me some, but 6 made cuts at the track in a row. Some of his accuracy totals might be a deterrent here from an ownership perspective because everyone knows he finished first on tour last season in that category. I would rather play Dominant facing the 2 off against one another, but I can certainly understand Todd, in a vacuum situation with that. Seamus is a unique case study of the group. As I mentioned, he hasn't been good at the venue, but he's much better now than he's ever been. There have been some red flags with him recently, but he's holding steady on my model for the most part. And then I really like Chris Kirk at 8,000 as my favorite play in this range. That seems to be an every week thing that Kirk is showing up as one of the best values, but he won this event in 2013 with and has an additional 4 top 18s in his last 7 showings at the tournament. He grades 4th for me from an upside perspective, making him a golfer that might be worth a look as an outright bet also. So to recap that for me, Kirk and Dahman would be my 2 favorite plays of the group. Bradley, Seamus, and Todd have some red flags but are in play. And the only other one that I'm going to give a look to is Justin Rose at 8,800. The price is too much, but maybe you can throw a dart on him as an under the radar type play with the narrative that I used at the Wyndham. Statistically, he fits the course and has a potential for a golfer that's going to be about 5%. But that does it for me in the 8,000s. Anything I missed that you like or anyone you are higher on than I am in general?
No, actually, to be honest with you, Chris Kirk is, for me and you, Chris Kirk's become a play. A lot of these fall stops for me. Courses just seem to fit him very well. He models out well. Seamus Power is an interesting name you brought up. I know he's been on kind of the bad side of things here recently, but a guy pretty much across the board that does a lot of things well in his golf game. There's not a whole lot of weaknesses. So he's interesting. The other guy I'm going to play is going to be Justin Rose. And listen, Justin Rose will be low owned in my opinion. I think there's that upside there. And so you kind of throw the two together. And I know he's kind of a volatile player you just never know kind of what you're getting here as of recent. It's certainly been way more bad than it has good. But there are things that, in the last tournament that we can lean on and kind of look at. And I think the golf course, to your point, sets him up well. So I'll be in on Kirk and I'll also be on Justin Rose.
Volatility is a good thing when a player is going to be less than 5% owned. I'd rather have that upside mixed into the equation. Yes. I don't want the guy that's going to come in 60th place. If I'm going to play in GPPs, I want the guy that, he might miss the cut, but if he does give you that upside performance, he might win the tournament. And Justin Rose's name, just on the surface is probably the best name in this tournament. From a historical sense with it, he's 10th in my model in that weighted strokes gained on short, easy Bermuda courses. If I look at his GIR gain stat, he's in the top 25 there. The putter's been good recently. Obviously, I don't want people relying on their putter, but it's a course where you're going to have to make putts, and it's kind of the perfect setup. And we saw it at the Wyndham Championship. And if everybody's going to like Kevin Kisner and want to play Kevin Kisner as an outright ticket, guys like Adam Scott, Justin Rose, all of those guys were those were my 2 pivots of that tournament when everybody was on Kisner. And I played Kisner also with it, but I just think it's a unique spot that you can get guys that are maybe coming in a little bit under the radar. And at Justin Rose, anytime he's less than 5% on a short course, I always think he is at least worth another look. But As we move into the 7,000s, I am going to have us go through this group in the same fashion I did last week of splitting them into sections so we can get a more structured discussion. So let's say 7,900 to 7,400. Who are a handful of your favorite plays?
So in that range, in as much as I have hesitancy to do this, I just think it's the right play. I'm going to take Patrick Rogers. Um, Trending in the right direction, last 5, last 10. We know anybody that does models and looks at things, he's a name that tends to pop, and it's usually not always something that works out. Clearly to his win total, it's not. But I just think this golf course makes a lot of sense for him. And again, he's second in strokes gained total in the last 24 and third in strokes gained off the tee. So the guy's a ball striker. We know kind of what he is. It's just you need to catch him on the right week. And I'm okay rolling the dice there at 7,700.
Yeah, if we just look at what Patrick Rogers has done over his last 24 rounds and compare it to my model, let me run through these numbers. So he is over his last 24. He's 70 spots higher over his last 24 in strokes gained total. He's 70 spots higher in strokes gained tee to green. He's 20 spots higher off the tee, 54 spots higher approach, 11 spots higher around the green, 29 spots higher in putting. So across the board, he's a guy that seems to be coming into the week with good form. That's always something to look at. When I look at my guys, I will kind of rapid fire off a bunch of people here. We've seen an improvement with Matt Kutcher recently at 7,900. 4 made cuts out of 5 tournaments. It does seem like he's likely a better cash game play because of his potential is a little bit capped. He has a cap ceiling there, but he's beginning to get back to his old self. If comparing directly for GPPs, you run into a lot of the same issues with Charles Howell, but I'm more inclined to think you can fit him into all builds. He did win this title in 2018 and has produced 2 top 30s in these other starts since 2016. Brian Harmon would be GPP only at 7,800, but he is one of the better contrarian values I can find in this group. 3 top 32s in his last 4 at the track. The iron play is worrisome, having lost in 7 straight. But while the results during that time have been far from good, he isn't exactly bombing his performances either. 3 have resulted in missed cuts. The rest have ranged from a 29th to 75th. I mean, that's definitely not like, I'm not bragging that 29th to 75th is where you want to be with it. And he's far from my favorite play, but he does have top 20 win equity in this field. And I think that means something when nobody's going to want to play him. I really like Matt Wallace at 7,600. He's someone that never grades out well for me, but landed 4th in my model when looking at an overall rank. Best way to deploy him is likely in cash, but 10 to 11% is low enough for me to consider in GPP still. It wouldn't be a show of mine if I didn't mention Jason Day at 7,600. It seems to be a good sign that he decided to tee it up in back-to-back starts. He had mentioned that we might only see him 3 times in total over the next handful of months. So I assume the back feels healthy. He finished 12th last year at the event and is one of the top 3 contrarian values I have in the 7,000s. The other 2 that were 29 spots or above were Brandon Grace and Lanto Griffin. There were a handful of others that I will get to shortly that fell right beneath. And then I guess the last 2 in this range that I will mention, I like Brandon Grace at 7,400. I think that kind of goes without saying how many times his name has popped up out of my mouth with just talking random stats here. And I like Emiliano Grillo at 7,400. Unlike Keegan Bradley, Grillo actually saw an improvement of 30 spots with his putter. Anytime the words putting and improvement go together for him, you might think it's a mistake, but he's a little better than neutral last year on these greens, and that's always an accomplishment in and of itself. As I traverse us into the $7,300 and below range, this feels like a nice bounce back spot for Lanto Griffin, who was in the 8,000s last week. I don't love his price tag, or I didn't like his price tag for the US Open, or the Houston Open, but he ranks between 16th and 60th in all other categories. If we remove the specific par 4 scoring range, he ranks 24th overall in my model and looks to be sub 3% after missing the cut the last 2 times at the RSM. Brian Stewart has 3 top 50s in the past at Sea Island, GPP only for me, but he could be under 3%. And then Steele, Shank, McCarthy, Glover, and Smalley all registered as values themselves. As always, you can get more of a breakdown from me if you check out the live show I do for Win Daily Sports with my guys Sia Najad and Joel Schreck. That airs Tuesdays at 5 o'clock Pacific time. But round out the rest of this range for us, Drew, before we wrap this up in the 6,000s.
Yeah, so for me, the guy that I'm looking at is actually at the bottom of it. It's Denny McCarthy. I'm taking this off of recent form, right? He's had 2 top 15s in his last 2 starts. Bermuda's his best surface. He's gaining. I mean, when we break this down in the last 24 strokes gain, he's in the top 5 with the putter. So at this range at 7,000 flat, I just think that Denny McCarthy's value, and we can base it off of recent form, and we kind of have some stats to back us up as well. The other guys down there, let's look. Who didn't you mention? Dylan Fratelli. He's always a tough play, right? So Dylan Fratelli, I feel like there are specific golf courses that fit him. I do not think that this is one. And then Patton Kizzire is interesting because Patton Kizzire does kind of model out well in certain things, but for me, recent form is going to have me out on him. And I don't know who else we missed there in the 7K,
but just to add a little bit to Kizzire, and McCarthy, I guess both of them, they both graded as positive values for me too. So I'm not going to talk anybody out of it. I think Kizzire would be GPP only. He has a positive trajectory in GPPs and negative trajectory in cash. So that's going to take him off the board, the recent form more so for that for Kizzire. I don't know if we missed anybody else. As you said with Fratelli, I mean, he's always, I think, better on these courses where off the tee comes a little bit more into play, or at least his distance can come into play with it. But as I mentioned, off the tee was 2 or 3% more impactful here than an average stop. Maybe that's because of the accuracy sense with it. I don't know if we missed anybody else. I guess like a guy like Lucas Glover, I don't know if I brought him up. He showed up to be a little bit of value, but I guess that's it for there. Let's wrap this up in the 6,000s. I'm sure we're going to get some guys here that crack the top 10 like always, but I'm going to pick and choose my spots. Harry Higgs, 6,900 might be trending towards a more steady golfer than I envisioned him being. 7 made cuts over his past 8. I do think you can use him as a salary saver in various builds if you get stuck down here. Zach Johnson, 6,900 might be worth a flyer in GPPs. 3 top 8s in his last 4 at Sea Island. Camilo Villegas falls under that same mold at 6,800. Cameron Davis has been all over the map recently at 6,800, but this is a price tag I never thought we'd see on him again after he won the Rocket Mortgage in July. We aren't that far removed for a golfer I believe to be one of the most talented young players on tour. We always think distance with Davis, but it's steadily been this club down or these club down spots where he's found most of his success. And then I will rapid fire off some names here that showed as a value for me. Michael Thompson, 6,700. Scott Stalling, 6,700. Kramer Hickok, 6,600. Andrew Putnam, 6,400. Davis Thompson, 6,400. Roger Sloan, 6,300 if you're willing to throw a complete dart. And then my model continues to like Paul Bergeron at 6,000. I have a proper price on him to be 6,700. There are some other players with value in this range that I have. You can use my model and get any of those guys and see them for yourselves. But those were at least the guys that were the most notable for me. What did you like down here?
Yeah, I'm with you on Zach Johnson. Also with you on Kramer Hickok. All coming off of a very, very good week last week. The other guy that I'm going to go with is Cameron Young at 6,800. Relatively new player coming off the KFT tour. Good finish at Sanderson. I think there's some upside there, especially at 6,800. He'll be low owned. Very good player off the tee. Solid. He's really got a solid all-around game outside around the greens. I just think those three, there's actually, in my opinion, this is a nice week for 6,000 players, but not much past the 6,800, 6,700 range, right? We want to have these kind of fillers at the back end, but I'm not willing to go too down deep into it. But there's some the names at the top, and those three stand out to me that I'll definitely have, in some lineups.
Yeah, I mean, past the $6,700 range, I mean, like the only people that I guess I would be using to a given percent at least, Andrew Putnam, Davis Thompson, those might be the only two. I mean, I'll fit Paul Bergeron into some builds because my model, I'm just going to go with that, and I tend to try to trust my model in these situations. But I like it. I think that's going to do it for the DFS portion of this show. Before I let you get out of here, I do want to get any bets you were thinking of placing or have placed up until this point.
Yeah, so I was not one that was on the Kevin Kisner 50 to 1, 35 to 1. that just wasn't me at this point. So here, like with that in itself, I just don't think that his game has been good enough leading into this to think that he's going to win. But other guys that I have put a bet in, let's see, I got to pull up my bet list here on my phone. Perfect. So yeah, I had Cory Connors at 24-1, and I only have 3 outrights. I did take, excuse me, Seamus Power. I know we talked about him and kind of his volatility, but he's at 60-1. And then I'm also in on Matt Kutcher at 65-1, which you mentioned earlier. So those are the 3 I'm in for right now. I just, I do like Scotty this week, as I mentioned, but at 10-1 with 0 win equity, it's just not something that I can get behind right now. Again, and you can make the case for a couple of those guys, but I actually think that the best case in the top 5 or 6 outright wise is Cory Connors, and so that's kind of where I'm at.
Yeah, Cory Connors is going to probably be where I start my card also. You can get my full betting card on my podcast, Better Golf. I'm still putting together the final pieces there as we speak. I think a Kutcher play makes a lot of sense, and I agree with you on Kisner with it. Like, I know that that's the popular play, but and I did mention this even when I was talking about him. He makes more sense as an outright bet at 50-1 if you were going to go down that route. Like, I like that better than a DFS play. So I'm not like, if you have a bet on him, it's not like time to panic. There's just a lot of volatility around it, and sometimes that can be a good thing for these outright bets. But I just don't like where his game's at. But I wanted to thank you for coming on this show, Drew. I've wanted to do this for a long time for us to team up together on this. I feel like it's been a long time coming, but I really enjoyed the conversation. Please let everyone know one more time where they can find you, and talk a little more if you can about everything you have going on.
Yeah, so you can find me at Detroit Dave 7. Did the Approach podcast on Mondays with my guy Rob. We're kind of on a little bit of break here until we get the swing season's done. So but yeah, find me at Detroit Dave 7, the Approach podcast. Rob and I do DFS theory, kind of game strategy. You just kind of walking through things. It's trying to make everybody kind of think a little different when we're talking about putting these GPP lineups, because there's value in trying to think of what other the people you're playing against are thinking. So but yeah, man, I certainly appreciate you having me on. I had a lot of fun, and I look forward to a good week.
I have one more question for you before I let you go, actually.
Yeah.
So Detroit Dave 7, the name is Drew. What is the story with that?
Yeah. So my middle name's Dave, and Detroit Drew was taken. So I guess, listen, when I made Twitter, I had 0 ideas of doing shows and whatnot. So it's just the name that I went with. That's the kind of the end of it, man, to be honest with you.
Well, I always wondered that. That was one of the questions I wanted to ask you, but I highly recommend giving Drew a follow and checking out his show. As he said, it's one of the top DFS podcasts in this industry for all the reasons that he ran down. I love shows where you're trying to get outside the box thinking. That's something that we try to do on this show. Drew and Rob do a really great job of that. But you can find me on Twitter at Toff Sports. You can find this show at Be the Number Pod. And as Drew just said, you can find him at Detroit Dave 7. Good luck this week to everyone investing money into the RSM Classic. And I will be back in 2 weeks for the Hero World Challenge. Thank you, guys.